Hi, I'm Eliot, the IELTS expert at Magoosh, and I love helping students achieve their goals on the IELTS exam. In this lesson, we're going to be focusing on IELTS Writing Task 1 prompts, where you have to respond to tables. There's a lot of data on these tables you have to process and think through how to write about it for your Task 1 response. So we're going to look at some tips on how to approach IELTS Writing Task 1 prompts with tables, and then we'll put those tips to use with a sample essay towards the end of the video. So let's take a look at these prompts. Here's an example of a Task 1 prompt with two tables. Now, keep in mind that your Task 1 prompts may have different kinds of visuals for you to look at. There may be a mixture, maybe a table with a bar chart or a pie graph of some kind. We're going to look at a question that has two tables here because that's what we're focusing on in this particular video. Okay, so let's take a quick look at our sample question. We're going to go over some tips after we read this question, and then we're going to look at a sample response to this Task 1 prompt later in the video. Okay, but first, let's just take a quick look. Here's a summary sentence we have for the prompt. It says, "The tables below give information about the historical financial cost of earthquakes in two regions of the world." Okay, so we've got earthquakes in East Asia and the Americas, okay? And we've got the date, location, magnitude, and cost information on these tables for the costliest or most expensive earthquakes in both of these regions. Okay, so we've got all this data that we're looking at on these two tables. The question is, how should you piece together your response for a Task 1 question with tables like these? Okay, so let's look at some tips first, and then we're going to go through a sample answer to this particular question, applying those tips and showing you how to put them to use. Okay, so first of all, some general tips. When you first come to a table question, a question that includes a visual, at least one of the visuals that's a table, what should you do? All right, well, as with any Task 1 prompt, your most important job is to be able to describe the visual accurately and efficiently. You need to be able to take data that's written on the visual itself, in this case a table, and be able to translate it into your own words, but accurately translated and efficiently, meaning you don't just list a bunch of information that you see on the visual, you actually do something with it. You have to consolidate it or categorize it or do something to organize that information in order to get a really good score on your Task 1 prompt. Okay, so how do we do that with these tables? Well, first of all, it's important that your response identifies all the categories on the table. You don't want to leave any information out of your analysis, okay? So make sure you at least mention in some way each of the categories on the tables. We'll look at that example in a second, okay? A good idea on any Task 1 prompt is to look at the data and find shared or related categories, okay? That's going to be pretty easy in our table question because both tables include the exact same categories, the same basic information. They just provide different data for each one. Okay, so we're going to hopefully have a pretty easy time finding shared information among the different visuals we have in this prompt, but that's what you should look for generally as you look at these table prompts. Okay, and the last thing is to paraphrase key terms. All right, so let's take a look at these and think through how to do it with our sample prompt here. First of all, identifying the categories. Okay, well, in the most basic level, our categories are, we're talking about earthquakes, okay, in both. We're talking about regions of the world, Americas and East Asia. And then we have the category labels for each column in our chart, okay? And that's what we're talking about. Really, the same information for both charts is included. Okay, so we need to identify these pieces in our response, probably in our introduction, as we're just discussing the basic elements of the tables we're looking at. We'll want to mention exactly which categories are included in our table here. Now, keep in mind, it's probably not going to be possible for you to mention absolutely all the information in each cell, okay? So you don't need to cover that much data in your response. You do need to find ways to talk about the most important information or the biggest trends or the stuff that stands out as key data on your table. We're going to talk about that later in the lesson, how to make those determinations, okay? But you do, at a minimum, need to talk about the major categories in your table. Okay, so that's what we have for this one. These headers at the top of each column, and in the title, we get these major pieces of information that are covered on the table. All right, now we're supposed to find shared or related categories on the table. Okay, we've already discussed this. Lots of similarity. In fact, exactly the same categories between the two tables, and we're looking at the exact same data up here. So we should, in our response, be able to have an easy time making comparisons between the two charts, since they're basically exactly the same information. Okay, finally then, we need to find words that we can paraphrase on our tables. Okay, trying to find some language we can use to replace some of the words on here so we don't have to keep repeating the language that's provided to you in the question itself. That's something, if you can do well, if you can paraphrase words well from these visuals, it's going to help your score on your task 1 response. Okay, so let's look at some possibilities here. Some examples of words and phrases that could be modified and paraphrased in your response. So an obvious one in both here is expensive. We actually have a kind of synonym for expensive here already with cost. So something that's expensive could also be described as costly or the costliest. If we're thinking of the most expensive, it would be costliest. Earthquake would be the paraphrase there. That would be a possibility to use that word as a replacement or as a synonym at various places in your response. Okay. Now, when we're talking about earthquakes, the word magnitude is kind of a technical term. That's the word we use to talk about the strength of an earthquake. Okay, but the word strength, discussing how strong an earthquake is, would be a good paraphrase, a good synonym to use instead of magnitude in your response. So there would be another possibility of a replacement paraphrase that we could do there. Okay, now these locations, this location category, here's one down below. So we could describe locations as places or sites, okay, the sites where the earthquake occurred. That would be a possibility as well. Okay, so another option there. And then finally, notice that a bunch of earthquakes listed here occurred in the same areas of the world, the same regions. Okay, so if you're finding yourself talking about all the earthquakes that happened in California over and over, or repeatedly mentioning California, you could maybe replace it at some place, at some point in your response with a discussion of the same region of the United States. You could say that the earthquakes happened in the same region, okay, as a phrase that would replace a discussion of earthquakes happening in California, for example. Okay, so some possibilities there. I'm sure there are many others you will come up with, but keep that in mind. And as you practice your Task 1 prompts with tables, look at the tables, really think through how you can describe the categories and the contents of the table in your own words with different language. All right, we still haven't analyzed our tables yet. So we have to think through what is the most important information we would want to pull out and discuss in our response. So here are some tips on how to choose, how to select the data on the tables that you're going to report about in your response. You want to look for the things that stand out the most. Okay, so those things are typically large changes. Okay, sharp contrasts. When one thing is high, another thing is low. Okay, are there places on the tables you're looking at where you see some things that are extremely different from one another? That would be a contrast in some way. And usually that is going to be something interesting you're going to want to report about in your response. similarities, things that are strikingly similar. Okay, so we already saw in our tables many of the earthquakes occurred in the state of California. Okay, that's a similarity among those quakes. That could be a noteworthy thing to talk about in your response. Okay, so what are the striking similarities? Are there trends you notice? Okay, so for example, are earthquakes more expensive in one region of the world compared to the other? Well, if you remember on the charts, if you looked at those closely already, you'll actually see that yes, in fact, the earthquakes in East Asia are far more expensive than the ones that occurred in the Americas. Okay, so that could be both. That could be a trend. That could be that could be a sharp contrast to notice the cost differences between those. Those kinds of things are what you want to look for as you're choosing what to report about in your response. All right, but let's take a look at our tables and think through exactly what information we would want to pull out in order to respond to these tables in a Task 1 prompt. Okay, so a few things stand out, right? If we look closely, as we noted earlier just a moment ago, with the earthquakes in the Americas, most of them happened in California. Okay, that would be something that certainly seems like a pattern. Okay, in the table we're looking at the bottom here. So that would be something we would want to pull out for sure. But how about what are the most costly earthquakes on either chart? Well, when we start looking at the cost column, we notice some interesting things. First of all, as we noted again, the earthquakes in East Asia are far more expensive than the earthquakes that occurred in the Americas. Okay, so we've got the costliest earthquake of all, which happened in 2011 in Tohoku. That one cost $122 billion, okay, compared to all of the earthquakes in the Americas, just far more expensive than any of the ones that occurred on the other part of the world, okay? And other East Asian quakes were also quite expensive. The one that occurred in 1995 in Japan, that one was $100 billion. And the one that occurred in 2008 in China, that was $75 billion, okay? Just far and away more expensive than the earthquakes in Americas. That is absolutely a contrast we would want to pull out and report about in our response, okay? So when we look at our sample response in a minute, we'll see how that works out and how we can report about that, okay? Now, another interesting pattern to note in our tables here, that the most powerful earthquakes do not necessarily equal the costliest earthquakes, okay? So, for example, look at the 1989 earthquake in Chile, okay? That is the strongest earthquake that's listed on either table, okay? This one here, the one that occurred in 1960 in Chile. That was 9.5 magnitude on the Richter scale. Okay, but that earthquake cost $5.8 billion. Okay, so even though it was the strongest earthquake, it was not even close to the most expensive earthquake. Okay, the most expensive, as we noted earlier, was the 2011 quake on Tohoku, okay, in Japan. So there's an interesting contrast, again, that we would want to pull out because it's such a huge contrast between cost, but then also interesting because it really does appear that cost does not necessarily connect directly with the size or the strength of the earthquake. Okay, so these are all things we would want to talk about in our sample response. Let's look at a sample response and just walk through the different parts of an essay responding to these tables. Okay, so we could have a sample paragraph 1. Remember, paragraph 1, your goal really is just to summarize the contents of the visuals you're looking at. And so we want to be able to summarize what information the tables include in a very basic way. So we've got two nice little sentences here explaining those things. It says, the two tables cover date, location, magnitude, and cost for expensive earthquakes in East Asia and the Americas. The East Asian table has 4 earthquakes and the American table has 5. Okay, very basic information. Since the columns have shared data like we talked about earlier in this video, it's very easy to combine our description of both tables since so much is shared. That's in a very efficient way to describe these two tables here in our first paragraph by combining all the information that's shared. Okay, now let's go on to paragraph 2. It says, relatively few places are represented on these tables. Japan has 2 earthquakes, one in Hanshin and one off the coast of Tohoku. Then Sichuan, China, has one of the costliest earthquakes, and Jiji, Nantou County, Taiwan, has the other. In the Americas, all but 2 quakes take place in California, a single state within the USA. In California, there were quakes in San Francisco, Loma Prieta, Santa Cruz County, and Northridge, LA County. The other 2 America's incidents are both Chilean, in Valdivia and Maule. Okay, so in this paragraph, we're giving an overview of where the earthquakes occurred, noting that they occurred in relatively few places. Even though we've got several earthquakes listed, they happened mainly in California, Chile, and then in a couple of countries in the other on the other table. Okay, so that's sort of the organizing principle here, noting that on both charts, these earthquakes happened in just a couple of regions. All right, let's continue. Paragraph 3. There are some noticeable differences and similarities in the data in these two tables. The Americas quakes span a longer period of time, from 1906 to 2010, compared to East Asia's 1995 to 2011 range. East Asian quakes are also far more expensive, with Japan's quakes costing $100 billion more, but Maule $30 billion and Northridge $20 billion being the most expensive American ones. Okay, so here, pulling out that striking contrast between the 2 tables here that we see, that even though the Americas earthquakes are quite strong, the cost is quite a bit less than the East Asian quakes listed here. Okay, finishing the paragraph. On either table, the highest magnitude doesn't automatically equal highest cost. Hanshin cost $100 billion, but had the lowest magnitude in East Asia, 6.9. And in Chile, Maule's 8.8 earthquake cost about $24 billion more than Valdivia's 9.5 earthquake. Okay, so really providing details there to explain this interesting trend. It appears that again, the cost is not really correlated with the strength. Okay, so in that last paragraph here, paragraph 3, just simply pulling out data to support the basic idea, showing these contrasts that are interesting between these 2 tables. All right, so the last and final thing to note here about tables, this is something that I always say when I'm talking to students about studying for Task 1, is that you need to have the vocabulary in order to do Task 1 well, to know the kinds of words you would use to describe these contrasts or these trends or these interesting commonalities between the visuals that you're looking at. All right, so to get some ideas about vocabulary you should study for Task 1 prompts, go ahead and click on the link that you see down below. That'll take you to a page with some vocabulary resources at the top. It will also, there's also a link there to another sample Task 1 prompt that uses tables, and you can practice your own essay there and see a sample response for that essay. All right, so to finish out this video, I'm going to put the full essay up on the screen for you to take a look at. You could pause your video and read through the entire thing if you like, and then we'll finish off the lesson after that. All right, I hope you liked the video. If you want more IELTS writing tips and strategies, check out these videos on the left, and I'll see you in the next lesson.